Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. You can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/ConversationCast. There are over 150,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. Sir Ranulph Fiennes is an extraordinary man. I had this conversation with him when his autobiography Beyond the Limits was published. You meet him and you know he's been to places that the rest of us wouldn't even consider because his handshake is best described as incomplete. And you think, why does this man do all of these things? But in the book, he admits that one of his early ambitions was thwarted because he just didn't get the A-levels.
Hello, my guest today is one of the world's one-offs. He has done things that you and I wouldn't even dream of doing. Sir Ranulph Fiennes, welcome. I get the feeling from reading this that if you'd had a few decent A-levels, you'd have done something completely different.
Physics and maths A-levels meant that you could go to Sandhurst Cadet College and join the army as a regular officer, which is what I wanted to do. But unfortunately I couldn't get them, so I didn't, and that's why I ended up doing what I did. Yep.
So when you look back now, this book is kind of all the things I've done, isn't it? It's up to date. Do you look back at it and go, wow, all this in one part of a lifetime?
No, you just think, what's next? You start looking at the next chapter all the time. Otherwise you're sort of done. You mustn't ever rest on your laurels, which is one of the messages, I think, of the book.
Yes, because it's the distillation of the things you have learned, isn't it? And you start back with your earliest military stuff in the 60s. Was that formative?
Yes, it was, except that fighting communists in sort of jungle desert areas, you're up against human obstacles which are much more lethal and unpredictable than natural obstacles like crevasses or sea that's moving about, or ice on the sea.
You do say, you chronicle what made you think that leading expeditions could be a profession for you. What was the first one that you decided to do?
When I found that I couldn't stay in the army because of this lack of A-levels, I was about 26. I was sort of getting on. It was a time of mass unemployment in the UK, and I got married. I needed to make a living pretty rapidly, and the only thing the army had taught me which had a commercial application was teaching soldiers how to ski and climb and mountaineer and canoe, and so I could have become an adventure training instructor, but in those days there weren't many of them. It was very competitive. It was before there were incidents of students on canoe trips drowning and a lot of blame being attached, and then suddenly they wanted lots of adventure training instructors even for schools with diplomas, and when I was looking for a job that wasn't the case, and so my wife and I decided that we would try to entrepreneurially set up a setup of expeditions which paid for themselves and also gave us a living. And we looked around, there wasn't anybody else doing it. They all had second jobs, but we thought it might work, and so we started around about 1969 or 70, just before I left the army, whilst we still had the umbrella of army salary.
Well, what was the first trip?
The first trip was a failure. We were going to cross the Anatolian desert by camel, and unfortunately they had a war there, so the Ministry of Defence, under which we still were, told us we couldn't go with only 4 days before we were due to set out. So we had to switch it, and we switched it to something very secondary, like crossing the Pyrenees with a mule, I think. But that was the early start.
And at that point, I mean, you talk about the way you have to use the English language. That on one page you're pitching for sponsorship, and you want you want some Land Rovers or whatever, you go, oh, this is going to be so difficult. This is going to be so difficult. You know, you're going to get loads and loads of coverage, and then you're going straight on to talk to some insurance people, and you're saying, I think the quote is, it's going to be about as exciting as a Tupperware party.
Yeah, I don't think you could call that lying.
No, I didn't say it was lying. I just said it was creative use of.
Creative use, that sounds like lying. I think that it's just a question of putting everything in its correct perspective, the way that they would like to hear it. So if you're talking to insurers and you want insurance, you describe it as non-risky. And if you're going to the Observer newspaper to try and get a lot of money for coverage, they like risk, and so you make it sound risky. It's just a question, you know, what you focus on at the time.
When did it come? When did you cross the line where, say, Land Rover were happy to help? And there must have been a time when they weren't happy, and that turns into a time when they were happy.
Yeah, that's the very awkward time, and any entrepreneur is going to have to risk getting heavily into debt, probably for a certain period, and that is the big risk period where you're trying to get into a known situation where people will start trusting you because of what you've already done, and that's very awkward. And when you ask quite when we made the breakthrough, I suspect we made the breakthrough not until 3 years after we started. We did an expedition in British Columbia, which lasted about 5 or 6 months, I think. It was thousands of miles. And it happened that the BBC sent a film team with us. And it was very controversial. The BBC guys were pretty unpleasant. And we thought that the publicity was so bad that it would actually stop us progressing. But we soon learnt that any publicity is helpful, and the bad side of it soon gets forgotten. And I think that was when we made the breakthrough.
Yes, you talk about the BBC guys not being the nicest people in the world. Then you move on, and there's an interesting bit where you are selecting people that you'll go on an expedition with. And it seems that one of the lessons you've learnt is get people who are good under stress, that are very relaxed and have got fully formed, rounded personalities. Don't find people who are potentially edgy, because you don't want them that potentiality showing itself when you're in a difficult position.
Yeah, I think you put that very well. The word edgy, stress and unpredictability and discomfort brings it out in them, and when they're actually travelling and they start getting gangrene, that'll make them irritable. And it's just a question of not having people who get paranoid. You want them very level-headed, not actually thick, but possibly not having too much imagination.
What is it that you have to show as the leader? Because some of the things that you talk about in the book are not fun. And as I sit next to you, I'm very aware that parts of your hand, and you talk about this in the book, that parts of your fingers are not where they originally were. What qualities are there in you that give people the courage, the wish to continue, when maybe a logical response would be to say, actually, no?
I would like to think that there was something in my character which helped to get the other members of the team to keep going. But sadly, I think it's more the question of choosing the right people that don't need any real inspiration from the leader. They are already, you've chosen them because they've got all the determination to keep going when they're under enormous stress and pain and all the rest of it.
Is it a democracy when you're out there?
I like to make them think it is a democracy, and will ask their opinions, providing if they come up with an opinion which is not the one I want them to come up with, I am prepared to go their way, because it's not really too important. But where it's something is going to affect the possible success of the endeavour, and I reckon it should be done that way, then why be democratic about it and have sort of meetings if you know inside yourself that you're not going to agree with anything other than the way you want to do it? So it's best not to make them think that they have got a possible effect on the outcome. So I think probably best to be a dictator, but try to make them think that you're not being a dictator.
Would it have been easier for you to do the sorts of things you've done 50 years ago, 100 years ago, as you look at the planet and you set about this career in the late 60s, and there you are looking very fresh-faced and very idealistic. Are you a man of your time or slightly out of time?
If you start getting out of your time, the modern media will maul you to bits. So the science side of the expeditions is very important to the expedition, but to be honest, it's not terribly important to me. But we take scientists, they do very valuable work. They wouldn't be able to do it if we didn't take them. On one occasion we, for instance, mapped 1,400 miles of the world's surface in Antarctica where no map maker had been before, and actually no human being had ever been into this whole vast area of Earth before us. I mean, we were the first human eyes ever to see this whole big area of the Earth, which was quite fascinating. It was also worrying for me because I hadn't been able to make a schedule, not knowing what was there, if there were big crevasse fields or how high it would go. Only after we'd been there was it put on the map of the world. Now, if we had done that 7 years later, we would have been too late, because polar orbiting satellites can do it all, and we'd have been redundant. But no, we were just within our time, which I suppose was quite lucky. Now we wouldn't be able to.
In your 20s, 30s, 40s, you've done so much. At the end of the book, there's a picture of you running the London Marathon. There's a picture of you going up on a climbing machine. How does being 50-something affect your career now? Do you look at your body structure and do assessments of what it's capable of?
The assessments get done by the people at Farnborough who assess astronauts and soldiers and so on for special tasks. And they, 6 years ago, said that I was similar to 21-year-old athletes. So that was fine, but it was only fine then. 6 years later, it's only going to be fine if you've kept up the pressure. And it is really boring trying to keep fit. You waste a lot of time, but the older you get, particularly over about 47, you have to work on it much harder. So the only way of keeping going is to spend more and more time doing things like that. And after about 50, it's not only cardiovascular fitness that you need to work at all the time, it is also bodily strength, which until 50 you don't have to really work on at all, because everyday movements will be enough to keep it going. But after you're about 50, if you're a typical person, the strength declines enormously. From 19, when you achieve your peak strength, up until around about 47 to 52, depending on you, it'll decline very, very slowly without doing anything to compensate. After 50, you've got to compensate really hard by, for the first time, doing stupid things like lifting up weights. And so the answer to your question is, you just got to work at it harder in order to achieve the same performance.
You've been round, you've been across. Is there anything left to do? Is there anything worth pushing your body to the limit to achieve? Is the motivation still there?
On the different types of expeditions, many different types, whether it's rivers or jungles or deserts or polar areas or lost cities, the only one which is running out, because we've done them, is unfortunately the polar areas, because there's only 2 poles. If there were going to be an unlimited supply of new poles, that would be great, like volcanoes, but there aren't. So on that front, you would have to start getting gimmicky, which our group don't do. We have pure firsts. Now that there aren't any in that area, one would have to resort to doing it by motorcycle, or being the youngest person at 15 like they do on Everest, or doing it by balloon or camel or something like that. So I think I'll move out of that area, whereas if I was a mountaineer I wouldn't have to move, because there are still hundreds if not thousands of vast nasty peaks still unclimbed.
Okay. So have you got the next one planned and the one after that?
I never have 2 planned, and I have a problem that if you just do an expedition after an expedition after an expedition without pausing in between them to get some money back because nobody pays you for organising them or doing them, and that can be quite a few years. So in order to pay the debts from before and to have enough money to survive as a family, and you need to write books in between expeditions.
I mean, it's interesting that you started off when you're trying to market your experience, doing the town hall circuit, as you say, talking for old ladies who often found it difficult to keep awake. I think you quote £18 a gig.
Yes, and that £18 stayed at £18, no travel expenses, for about 4 years. Now, luckily, it's a lot more than that. And on the international business conference circuit, the demand is very great, particularly as for English speakers. Now that corporations are international, you'll normally have at least 16 nations in the audience, and so parochial jokes are lost, and you've got translators sitting in boxes who can't keep up. And so that lot, the Israelis, will laugh at a completely different time to the Spanish, and it's a fairly difficult setup, but it's a lot more financial remuneration than the town halls in the 60s.
At the end of each expedition, you give a list of things that I have learned, the lessons learned. And it can be 10 or 12 things on an expedition. Are there lessons that are common to the lot?
Yes, I mean, as the years go by and the expeditions teach you lessons, so when you come to a page summarising, they should get less and less because you should have learnt them in the early days. So those pages should get more and more sparse. If they don't, it means either that you're learning the same lesson twice, which shouldn't have to be the case, or else that because you're in ever new changing situations with new people and new equipment and so on, new lessons are completely new, and you are having to reappraise how to do something in the light of having new equipment. And also, I'm sad to say, in the polar areas, because the obstacles are changing due to the ozone hole. So what might have been quite solid ice in the 70s is no longer solid at all. It's quite lethal.
And as somebody who's got first-hand experience of this, do you find yourself, this isn't about what's in the book, but I'm just interested to know, as we sit in early winter 2000 of the world's press talking about global warming, do you feel you've seen that during your expedition time?
Not just me, but our scientific members as well are horrified. And we're talking about areas miles and miles away from the nearest factory chimney, where the pollutive indexes are just climbing through the roof.
And what is it? What I was left with at the end of all this is a kind of wow factor, and this man has done all this. Is there something, when I see you in the middle of an ice sheet or in this intense loneliness, is there something sort of transcendental about that? Is there something that you experience that I have never experienced? Is there something addictive in that?
Not really. It's a sort of, it's not mundane. It is very down to earth, because if any members of the expedition start getting spiritualistic or philosophical or introvert, they're sort of wasting time when they should be focusing on the next ice block or trying to get 16 miles per day in, because otherwise if they only do 14 miles per day because things have got really difficult, then the end result will be a failure, because you're up against tight seasonal problems in nasty areas where, given a certain date, if you haven't got to a certain place, you'll be in real trouble. And you don't look around for any ski planes or boats to come and rescue, because they've been withdrawn from the entire continent, and we're talking the year 2000.
All right, so I'm trying to look for idealistic, wishy-washy kind of moments. When is the big buzz then? When does the great wave of pleasure come? When it's all over?
No. The fairly small wave of pleasure, or intense but not long-lived, otherwise you'll start running into trouble, when you can take your eye off the job and shake someone's hand and think this is all really, made it well worthwhile, is a moment of success if you're the first human being to do it. So back in the early 80s, when two of us became the first humans to reach both poles, that was a second when you realise you've actually done it, after, in that case, 3 years of travel to do that, with all sorts of problems, and you just sort of can't believe you've actually finally done it, that this is the moment you've done it. But you can also believe you have, because you know it's there. The theodolite says that you're right there, and it is a very wonderful moment. It's not just you've stopped banging your head hard on the wall and how wonderful it feels not banging it any longer. It's not just that. It's all the enormous effort that you know you've put into it, and all your teammates too, has actually been rewarded. So it's relief as well as great joy.
This book is called Beyond the Limits, the lessons learned from a lifetime's adventures. The adventurer, Ranulph Fiennes. Thank you very much indeed for coming.
Thanks for listening to this episode of ConversationCast. If you're an author, artist, musician, or someone else who'd like to talk to us, or if you're a listener and you'd like to suggest someone you'd like to hear a conversation with, or you'd like to give us some feedback, or even just say hi, feel free to email us at theconversationcast@gmail.com. theconversationcast@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.